You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey guys and gals, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bacetta, PhD student at the University of Copenhagen. If you're enjoying the show, if you're learning something from it, make sure you tell a friend, tell a colleague, tell your students, tell your mom. You can find us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. It's no secret that the demographic makeup of the United States is changing, big time. According to the Pew Research Center, 59 million immigrants have arrived in the U.S. over the past 50 years, mostly coming from Latin American and Asian countries. This trend is only projected to grow, so much so that by 2065, about 1 out of every 3 Americans will be an immigrant or have immigrant parents, and that's up from about 1/4 of Americans today. With such a huge portion of the American electorate being comprised of immigrants, it's important that their communities be represented in the democratic process. However, immigrant communities traditionally vote far less than native-born Americans, and even if immigrants attain citizenship, those naturalized U.S. citizens tend to vote approximately 10% less than their native-born counterparts. In particular, Hispanic and Asian communities exhibit a comparatively low degree of voter turnout in national elections. According to the Brookings Institute, in 2012, only 44% of Hispanics and 47% of Asians eligible to vote casted a ballot, and that's compared to about 65% for both white and black eligible voters. While there may be vast cultural differences between and among these immigrant communities, one aspect uniting them is that they are relatively wired and active on social media. To throw some more figures your way, recent data from Pew shows that 73% of Hispanic adults use at least one social networking platform, compared to 69% of whites and 63% of blacks. Although those of Asian ethnicity were not included in this particular study, other research shows that Asian Americans are typically very high adopters of online technologies, although they don't tend to use them for political purposes. So the question is, can social media be used as a platform to increase voter mobilization, particularly among immigrant communities? In this episode, we'll be discussing how nonprofit immigrant organizations are using social media to do just that. And joining me now, via Skype from New York, is Dr. Heath Brown, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the City University of New York Graduate Center. Dr. Brown conducts research on public policy, nonprofit organizations, and elections, and recently published a new book with Cornell University Press entitled Immigrants and Electoral Politics, Nonprofit Organizing in a Time of Demographic Change. You can follow Dr. Brown on his Twitter account, @HeathBrown. Dr. Brown, congrats on the new book and welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast.
Thank you so much. I am such a big fan of the podcast and have listened to it and have been so eager to talk to you about the book. So thank you so much for the invitation.
You've got it. So I've been digging into your research and I find this whole topic super interesting, but it's one that I wasn't so familiar with before. Can you tell our listeners a bit about what you call immigrant-serving nonprofits? Who are they and what role do they play for immigrant communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're describing is familiar in the field of political science, where we tend to study explicitly political organizations. Almost by definition, that's what those in political science and political communications focus on.
Right.
My focus is a little bit different. What I focus on are those organizations in the United States that are not explicitly political, meaning 501c3 nonprofits using the U.S. lingo.
Okay.
These are organizations that provide health services, educational services, housing services. They are often small in resources and staff. They're typically embedded in a specific neighborhood or community. But for communities that are new to the country, that are new to the United States, these are vital services, and they're not often provided by government. For newly arrived immigrants in the United States who are lacking in the deep connections to the job market, lacking in professional opportunities, maybe lacking knowledge about banking and financial services. They may even face challenges related to basic language and culture. Because these are people whose status in the country is so connected to their politics, what I wanted to do is study these organizations that provide them vital services in their political context. And so what I'm basically doing is trying to understand the politics of non-political organizations in a nutshell, specifically for immigrants. And the immigrants that I study are not defined purely by the legal terminology. I'm interested in really anyone who self-identifies as an immigrant. And that includes people who would be categorized as first generation or second generation, or even in some communities, those that are called undocumented, who are in the United States and do not have the documentation, yet are living lives in neighborhoods across the country. And so the organizations that provide services to those people are the ones that I'm most interested in.
Right. And in the book, you're interested in how these nonprofits mobilize around political issues, particularly during elections. Can you fill our listeners in about what you did to explore this particular topic, and what did you find?
Yeah, absolutely. And so placing to the side political organizations, and there are political organizations that serve immigrants, but they're small in number in the United States. They're small in number and therefore small in influence. And so in most towns and cities and states in the United States, immigrants have very little representation. They're relatively few elected officials who are immigrants. Immigrants typically don't have the resources to participate in campaign finance, so they're not giving money to candidates. Into this vacuum, what I wanted to study is whether those organizations I mentioned earlier, what might be described as social service oriented, whether they see politics as somehow connected as a secondary objective of pursuing their mission. That is, to advance the health and education and cultural goals of an immigrant community. Are elections viewed as important? Now, a couple of caveats have to be added because these are organizations that can't do anything politically. Their legal status means in the United States, they can't endorse candidates, they can't give campaign contributions, and they can't get involved in purely partisan activities. So they can't join up with a political party to try to advance a political agenda. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of things that these organizations can do. And I was most interested in studying whether these immigrant-serving organizations did the things that they are legally permitted to do, including registering new voters, which is very important for immigrants, some of them who have just been naturalized, educating voters. Immigrant communities may not have information about candidates for office, and then mobilizing newly registered voters. That is, providing them reminders and opportunities to go out and actually participate in politics. These are things that are nonpartisan in nature, but very important to the civic life of the communities. And I studied this in 2012 and then again in 2013 through both surveys of organizations and also dozens of interviews where I asked questions about what these organizations were doing, including whether they were incorporating technology and social media into their electoral strategies.
Right. And just to kind of pick up on that, what did you uncover about these organizations' social media outreach? Were they actively using social media as part of a kind of developed communication strategy? And did you talk to any organizations that use social media to campaign or organize, particularly around these elections?
Yeah, and the findings were that some did and many didn't. Some were active users, early adopters of a variety of social media strategies, but most simply weren't engaged at all. And so what I found was at the start of the study in 2010, less than 30% of those organizations that I focused on were using social media. And I was trying to count Facebook and Twitter primarily as their ways into social media, knowing that that's not a perfect way to capture this. But I sort of set a very low threshold to see whether they were engaged in some way in one of these two social media platforms. But less than 30% were engaged at the beginning of the study in 2010. Now, this grew over time, not surprisingly, as social media has grown in its prevalence in all sorts of communities. And so that by 2012, the portion of groups that were using social media approached 50%. But still, many of the organizations were not actively engaged in social media as a political strategy. Now, when I interviewed the leaders of immigrant serving nonprofits, some described social media as very important to what they did. They were particularly drawn to the low cost of usage compared to other political tactics. Now, understand that most of these organizations have almost no budget for politics or elections, so that any tactic that can be had at a very low price is highly valued. And social media is one of those. But many other organizations I spoke to expressed different views, often related to staffing, so that even if the social media platform was essentially cost-free, the staffing and expertise needed to use the platform effectively was not free. Many of the leaders that I spoke to lamented the difficulty they had in finding staff that were capable of using Twitter, for example, in a responsible and effective way. And also, even more than that, the expertise to know the best usage. Basic questions about, okay, so we want to be involved in using social media to advance our political goals, but we simply don't know how to do it. That lack of knowing, the feeling of lack of expertise was a big part of this.
Right, and maybe doing it wrong or ineffectively.
Absolutely. The risks of doing it ineffectively, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, are a big part of why, even in 2012, I didn't find 75, 80, 90% of organizations using social media. The average was still very low, even as late as 2013. So it varied, but certainly not widespread in the way that we've come to think of social media as so ubiquitous in everyone's lives.
It's interesting because on the one hand, it is a kind of very low resource, low cost way to reach out to these communities. But I guess there is the issue of staffing, and there is the issue of you don't want it to sort of backfire, or especially among millennials, not looking cool, perhaps, or effectively reaching those communities.
Yeah, I think exactly what you describe is so important. These are communities that vary much more greatly than we sometimes think about. And the biggest differences that I observed was in which community the organization served. So, for example, nonprofits that serve Latinos were much more likely to use social media in their political activities than those that were serving the Asian American community. On average, it doesn't suggest that there were no examples of Asian American nonprofits using social media, but if we compare those two communities that have large percentages of immigrants, and this varies from state to state, but large percentages of immigrants, we see that pattern emerge. In 2012, I found that a majority of Latino serving nonprofits in the study were using social media compared to just a third of Asian American nonprofits. Now, one of the reasons for this is the demographics of each community. On average, the Latino community is younger than the Asian American community in the United States. We know that the rate of mobile technology adoption, for example, in the Latino community was very fast, really faster than any other ethnic community in the US. What this has meant is an audience that has been much more receptive and open to social media than within the Asian American community because of these age demographics. And the organization Voto Latino, I think, is a perfect example of that recognized the demographic patterns in the United States, a rising share of the population, but also the relative ages of who they were serving. And they adopted a very aggressive and purposeful social media campaign that focused on this younger demographics. They used Latino celebrities who had large social media presences that may not have been focused in the past on politics and elections and voting, and convinced them to get involved in mobilizing younger Latino voters through Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms.
Yeah, I'm surprised at the number. It's quite low. But of those who actually were using social media, what were they using it for? Did you find similarities? I mean, we were talking differences between Latinos and Asian Americans, for example, but was there a common thread running through those that were actively using it?
Sure, it ranges. Some of what, and this would probably be the most common usage, which is not surprising, which is to provide information either to members of the organization or to the community more broadly about things like, when is the last day that you can register to vote? Or where is your polling location? Or remember that election day is on November 4th, or that the polls close at a certain time. So much of the use was from the organization out. And that, I think, dominates the strategy of many of the organizations. Some of the organizations have a somewhat more novel approach, which is sort of flipping their strategy and encouraging the community to share with them. And this is particularly the case with some organizations on election day. So we also know that in 2012 and 2014 and even in 2016 in the United States, there were deep concerns about voter suppression. There were deep concerns about very long voting lines, so that it would make it very difficult for people to come out and vote. And this was particularly felt in low-income communities, among immigrants. And so that one of the social media strategies was to encourage members and constituents to share photographs, for example, of the long lines that they were waiting on, or to note discrepancies that they found in things like whether there was language translation of voter ballots. And so that two-way communication, it was somewhat less common, but I think you see in the most effective organizations the way they viewed it. So they weren't simply viewing social media as yet another way to send information out. They also saw it as a way to collect information and serve as a repository for information about the election.
And also perhaps maybe having citizens doing the heavy lifting, or devolving that responsibility due to the low resource of their organizations.
I think you're right.
Interesting. So let me ask you about this. In an earlier episode of the podcast, we were talking to a group of politicians who were protesting the border controls between Sweden and Denmark on Facebook. And they were very clear in their online communication to only protest the border controls and not advocate any other policy agendas relating to their parties, because in their view, you want to hammer home only one single issue to avoid dividing up your audience. So the idea being that advocating too many political issues can fracture your audience and create division, whereas focusing on one single issue can be much more effective in terms of building a following and having a larger audience. So can you tell us a bit about what this might mean for an immigrant community? Because race and ethnicity might unite a group of people, but there's certainly individual differences among them, like income, perhaps attachment to their home country, or political affiliation. So how might immigrant-serving nonprofits juggle this diversity, particularly when it comes to social media?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and gets really to I think, one of the areas of controversy within studying immigrant and diverse communities. Communities that are truly diverse. From one perspective, and I think you see this pressure placed on immigrant-serving nonprofits in the United States, most of whom would not describe themselves that way. But from a distance, they're encouraged to view themselves in a very common way. So whether you're serving a community that is largely Asian American or Latino or Caribbean, there are all sorts of political pressures to develop what you described, a very common and unified political agenda focused on a small number of priorities. Now, recently in the United States, that's been connected to issues of undocumented Americans, so-called dreamers, and comprehensive immigration reform. Now, for some communities, that is a high priority. For others, it's really not. For other communities, what I heard was that other things mattered to them, and it wasn't necessarily that they disagreed with focusing on the undocumented issue, but it just wasn't at the top of their agenda. For some of those groups, they expressed to me that when they adopted a political strategy and they used social media, they would go along with it, and they would agree that while this might not be their number one issue, in the interest of a common front, they would approach it this way. Others expressed great frustration at that kind of pressure and revealed that their community felt like they always had to come second, And they weren't willing to go along with this, and they weren't willing to go along with a common strategy, even if they knew that that might be the more effective strategy. They felt this way, this is what they would tell me, in part because authenticity is so very important to many of these organizations. And many felt like agreeing to an agenda that wasn't really authentically their agenda would be a threat to them as an organization. And what they would tell me is they would prefer to be somewhat less effective, but authentic, that authenticity would matter much more than simply applying an effective social media or political strategy. And so those divisions, I think you see come up in a lot of ways in the study that I did and in the study of immigrants writ more broadly. We like to think of immigrants as all sharing a common identity. What I found is those differences in identity matter a lot for political and communication strategy.
That's super interesting. So you're saying that, for example, an organization wouldn't maybe adopt the use of memes because it might take away from the seriousness of their cause. If it would drive more engagement, it would affect their authenticity, something along those lines, where they're willing to sacrifice a little bit of engagement in order to kind of keep their purpose or their agenda.
You have communities in the United States that vary greatly, and they may share a newness to the country, but differences in culture and religion make certain practices acceptable and not acceptable in others. And one of the things that I observed is that in the United States, like most countries, newcomers arrive from very different political backgrounds, and the expectations that someone new to the United States has about politics that have come from successful and active democracies with effective democratic institutions and long successful experiences with political participation view politics differently than those that have come from repressive or totalitarian regimes. Now, the organizations that serve those two different communities have to adopt different approaches to politics, because you can't assume that people leave behind them all of that political socialization that's going to differ very greatly. And so when I talk to organizational leaders, they said that they pay a lot of attention to that because they don't want to be viewed as inauthentic because they're sort of assume that everyone agrees that voting is always a good thing, or that a loud political voice is always safe. Some communities are not yet convinced that political activism is the best way to pursue their goals. Some feel like keeping the community's head low and pursuing other strategies, purely economic, for example, is really the best way forward, because politics in the country that they came from was simply too fraught with risk. That's something that immigrants bring to their experiences in the United States that shapes the way organizations design their communication strategy and their political strategy more broadly.
Just picking up on this idea of identity, one of the key findings we know from research about immigrant voting behavior is that assimilation or socialization into American society and values generally correlates to a higher turnout. Now, this could be a bit tricky when it comes to immigrants serving nonprofits. So my question is, might initiatives aimed at celebrating the identity or traditions of a host country, whether online or otherwise, could that reify difference between the host and American identity? And does that have any kind of effect on political participation?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question and not one that's very easy to answer. What I did see when I talked to groups is rarely did I see engagement with home country politics described as a problem for political engagement in the United States. The idea that sort of political involvement is a zero-sum game, I think is not the way that I heard organizations talking. Mm-hmm. So if a community is keeping up with the news about elections far from their new community, doesn't discourage them from getting involved in elections in their new home. In fact, it might increase it because political engagement may breed more political engagement, and political awareness may breed more political awareness. A lot of this, I think, has to do with the political efficacy that a community feels. And the idea of political efficacy as distinct from political knowledge or political interest, I think matters a lot to nonprofit organizations. The sentiment within a community that their activism can affect change, or their political activism might come with risks of retribution, I think often separates how active and involved nonprofits are in the United States. And those sentiments and those beliefs about how effective getting involved in politics can be, I think, do vary from community to community. Asian American communities, research has shown, tend to have much lower levels of political efficacy than other ethnic communities in the US. And I think this results in expectations of different levels of activism by the organizations that serve that community. And so I think that while involvement in home country politics sometimes might seem like it might pull people away from involvement in their new home, I don't think that that's really the case in most situations.
And just to kind of highlight a case that I thought was interesting and a dynamic that I also thought was interesting was in the book you highlight this Min Kwan Center, which is a 30-year-old nonprofit that serves the Korean community. And originally, it wasn't very politically active. It was mostly aimed at helping Korean citizens register for government benefits, resolving debt, and obtain citizenship, and things of that nature. But it was the 1992 Los Angeles riots and the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that was stoked by that in the political sphere that really mobilized the Min Kwan Center to become very politically active and fight anti-discrimination laws. And so that brings us, of course, to this election, where immigration was particularly a key topic, particularly politicized by Donald Trump. And do you think this has any sort of mobilizing effect on immigrant-serving nonprofits?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I tried to approach is the idea that organizations can be transformed and can go through a series of stages of political activism. And so a social service-oriented organization like Min Kwan that was founded and had a mission to do exactly what you describe, at some point can change. And that change or that transformation might happen slowly. And we might observe the transformation with initially just sort of dipping the organization's toe into elections. Simply paying more attention to elections might be one thing that they might do. So they might adopt a single tactic or two tactics or three tactics. But over time, they might accumulate more and more. And so that at the end of some period of time, they may appear much more like what we think of as a interest group than as a social service agency. And so understanding that transformation was a big part of this. On the other hand, there are all sorts of pressures, especially recently, for immigrants to be less politically active. Some of this has taken the form of specific public policies aimed to reduce the participation of low-income and minority voters. Voter ID is the area that has gotten the most attention. That is requiring voters to have a specific form of government identification in order to vote. Some people have that kind of identification. Others who are citizens don't. And so it's viewed as a way to reduce the number of people who are turning out to vote. That's one example, but there are other, even more egregious examples, including the worst kinds of political violence, hate crimes, that for Latinos in particular have been on the rise over the last couple of years. In both of those cases, the policy and the hate crimes, there is the potential to demobilize the community as political activism comes with costs. It comes with retribution. And there has been a movement over the last 10 years that has been quite hostile to immigrants. What I found in the book is that there is evidence that some of those policy moves has actually decreased the likelihood that immigrant-serving organizations get involved in elections. And the way that I studied that is to compare organizations in states that don't have these kinds of voter ID laws with ones who had newly adopted them, and held constant a variety of other factors related to involvement in politics. And I found the organizations that were in these voter ID state, in this case it was Florida, were significantly less likely to register new voters in that state. What I took from this is that policy has consequences on involvement in politics, and that the demobilizing effect on policy can be felt both by individuals, but also by organizations. Organizations can be targeted just like individuals, which is all to say the current political environment that is transpiring now in Washington and in state capitals has consequences for immigrants. And there is the potential demobilizing effect of both the anti-immigrant rhetoric, but also, more importantly, the anti-immigrant policies that are likely to occur over the next 4 years. It's one of the reasons why countervailing efforts to encourage involvement are really important. If there is this negative pressure coming from all sorts of places, unless the country is comfortable with immigrants and immigrant organizations not being involved in politics, there have to be countervailing encouragements and pressures from the other side to get organizations and immigrants involved. And so that's sort of a meandering answer to your question, but I think that the consequences of the political change happening right now in Washington will be felt in local communities very far from Washington, and the likelihood that they're going to adopt aggressive, full social media campaigns to express the political will of their community is not guaranteed, and will take a lot of the encouragement and the momentum of countervailing forces. The now famous Women's March that happened in January of 2017 had some overlap with the interests of immigrants, but wasn't directly focused on immigrant interests. But that's something that could serve to continue the movement forward. But I don't think it's guaranteed. I think there are reasonable expectations that many communities are going to feel great fear and want to be less politically involved, perhaps as a way to avoid additional targeting.
No, I'm glad you meandered, because I think it's a very important aspect of kind of larger political shifts, and it's not particular to the United States. Here in Denmark, particularly in most parts of Scandinavia, there's been a huge influx of immigrants from the Middle East and other parts of Europe in the past 40 to 50 years, which has come as quite a shock to a very homogenous society. So we see this trend towards kind of anti-immigration, the rise of populist parties, Eurosceptic parties, general backlash to political elites. Do you think that your work in the United States is specific to that context, or is it generalizable to other national contexts where we see the same type of political phenomenon going on?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the way in which this plays out is very country specific. But what I think that I hope to have demonstrated in the book is the importance of institutions, and the importance of institutions that we don't often think of as involved in politics. So most political scientists, most students of politics would agree that institutions matter. But the institutions we typically focus on are the most formalized. Political parties, whether they're large or small parties, interest groups, political organizations, typically take up most of our time and our thought and our analysis. To just focus on those is to miss out on all of the other kinds of institutions that might matter. And I think this is risky during a period that you just described, where anti-immigrant sentiment, we can see this in lots of different places. And if we don't understand the way that non-political organizations get involved in politics, I think that we miss an opportunity for immigrant views and immigrant rights and immigrant interests to be represented. Now, the rules differ from country to country on what nonprofits, community-based organizations are and aren't allowed to do. But I think much more attention should be placed on the potential that they have to try to represent and provide a voice for immigrants. Because if they don't, I think it's much less likely that political parties will go out of their way to provide that voice. I think during times of political conflict, you have to have all sorts of institutions in place that are going to be sort of effective advocates for a diversity of voices. And we need more of those rather than less. And nonprofits provide one of those that I think need much more attention, both by scholars, but also by practitioners of the study of politics.
Right. Absolutely on point. And from your research, I mean, you find that they're limited by their resources, by their legal capacity, what they can and cannot do in the context of elections. So my kind of wrapping up question is, do you think there is a democratic potential, particularly for these organizations, to mobilize voters? Or do you think that it's more apt to say that social media use is generally about entertainment and may even be leading to more fragmented societies than a sort of social or political good?
Yeah, I think that there's huge potential to mobilize voters. I think that the sort of the second part of your question, the risk that social media and its related technologies will remain as sort of a purely entertainment, I think is not a great risk. But I think there is also this often unrecognized risk for organizations and individuals who engage in social media for retribution and for targeting. And so I think that's the side of it that needs the most attention. I don't think this is always a positive thing for an organization that represents immigrants or represents women or represents children, represents any kind of community in need, to adopt a social media strategy. Because I think that increasingly there's the possibility, and I think that you probably have talked about this before, but all of the backlash that is now a big part of social media, has become in some communities sort of just the worst of what we would expect for public communication. I think that's something that organizations have to understand. Getting involved in a social media campaign without a full awareness of the stakes and the potential risks is very bad strategy. Now, I think it's not good strategy to look at those risks and say, well, we're simply not going to get involved because of that potential, the positive potential. I think that organizations simply have to do this in a smart way. And if it's not done in a smart and thorough way, the risks may be too high for the communities that they represent. And so the potential is very great, but the unseen or unacknowledged risks are also great and need to be put into the full conversation about what any organization actually does.
Dr. Brown, super interesting and relevant topic. Best of luck in the future research, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had a blast with this.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Heath Brown, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the City University of New York Graduate Center. You can follow him on Twitter @Heath Brown. And to learn more about the themes we just discussed, you can grab a copy of his new book, Immigrants and Electoral Politics, Nonprofit Organizing in a Time of Demographic Change. And we're out of time for today, folks. Make sure, if you want to keep up with all the latest episodes, that you subscribe on iTunes. While you're there, it would be great if you would leave us a review. Make sure you also check out our social media accounts. You can tweet us @SMNP Podcast or check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. I'd like to thank the team at Copenhagen College Radio for getting this thing running, Earfunk for the jams, and Peter Orbeck for editing. I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.